I want to talk about prayer and the way that I experience prayer and understand prayer through a process perspective. Now, you might possibly think, well, what's so processive about that? Let me tell you some of the problems I had prior to coming at this way of thinking about prayer and experiencing prayer, and then you'll understand me better, perhaps. I used to think, if God already has everything already planned, well, what difference does it make that I pray about it? I mean, if it's going to happen anyhow, what difference does it make? Another problem I would sometimes have would be more like this. Well, if I'm praying for one thing and another person is praying for something else, and they two contradict each other, well, which prayer does God hear? You know, sort of like the old thing about two sport teams and fervent people praying for each team to win. Well, what difference? You can see the problem. I would also then sometimes run into a different kind of a problem. Why should God hear me? I'm just an ordinary person in the world. There are so many. How could God hear me? Once when I was in Florence, in Italy, I happened to have a room that was at the edge of the street, you know, and during the night I suddenly heard, it seemed all of these noises, like conversations all over the place, and I thought, well, maybe there's a parade down in the street or something. And I went and looked out the window and there was nothing there. And eventually I came to understand that somehow the way the room was situated with the draft window and the windows in the out street, I was hearing conversations from all these different rooms at once. And I began to think, it must be terrible to be God listening to people praying all over the place. It's nothing but this awful babble. How does God hear prayer? And how does God hear mine from out of the millions of other prayers that are being given at the same time? Now, maybe in one sense they're silly problems, but they're problems that I had. How does process help me understand prayer? And how does process help me experience prayer? Existence is relational. What relations? All relations. God is one who is in relation with everything which exists. Now, everything except me? What kind of a God would that be? Even me. Therefore, God hears prayers. How? With ears like me listening to all those voices in Florence? God hears feelingly. God hears from the inside. God feels our prayers. There's our language, you know, and I think that God must translate from our language to ourselves, to the reality of who we are. All prayer is honest. God feels who we are, and therefore God feels rather than hears our prayers. To be in relation is to be in relation with all things. A being like God is in relation with all things feelingly and has the ability to feel all, integrated into the divine nature and give back the appropriate response in billions of places and spaces at once. The concept of a God like that is to have a concept of a God to whom prayer matters. Also in a process context is this. God feels the world, right? How? As the world is. God works with the world as it is to bring the world to where it can be. And whether the world then moves to where it can be depends upon the world. God works with the world's response to God's guidance and again brings it to where it can be. Again and again, there's a faithfulness to God. Now, think of these two things. If in fact God is in relation to all of the world, then God hears all of our prayers, even mine, right? And if God works with the world the way the world is to bring the world to where it can be, well then don't you see? It makes a difference what is in the world. And when I pray, I have changed the way the world is. But if I've changed the way the world is through my praying, then I've also changed the way the world can be. My prayers actually make a difference. They give God something to work with in the world that is not there without my prayers. Therefore, prayer has a mattering effect. It changes, literally, changes the world. Now then, if prayer changes the world, do you see the difference it makes to our responsibility as persons who are in this world? It means then that we have a responsibility to pray for the world, to pray for those things which are of concern, because it makes a difference when we pray. If it makes a difference when we pray, we are then responsible for praying. We must pray. Prayer is not then a last resort, the thing you go to when all else fails, you know. Prayer is the first resort, because prayer is an immediate change of the way the world is. Therefore, it's not something you wait to do when all else fails. It's the first thing you do. You change the way the world is in relation to that thing which concerns you. But then the other thing is, you not only have a responsibility to pray, it's not only the first thing one does, but then you can release the prayer. Remember my problem? You know, which one is God going to listen to? Everyone. You release the prayer to God, so that God can work with that prayer according to God's own wisdom. And how is God wise? God is wise through understanding all of the circumstances, all of the context, all of that which is best, and all of its various ramifications. I certainly can't understand that. God can. Therefore, when I pray about a situation in the world, I'm then responsible for releasing that prayer and letting God do with it as God wills. And I get on about with my business in the world, whatever it may be. Now then, think, however, of this. When we pray in this process universe, we are responsible for changing the way the world is, for releasing that prayer so God can work with it. But in a relational world, God works with our prayers to change the way the world can be. We don't answer our prayers, God does. But God may answer our prayers through ourselves. So that to pray for the world is then to be open to be used by God to address the very needs for which we have been praying. It doesn't mean that we pray and then become puppets on a string going about answering our prayers. It's more like this. You pray for a situation, you release that situation to God, and then you are open to whatever seems to be appropriate with regard to your own action where that situation is concerned. You live in an openness when you live through prayer. Openness to act in that situation as seems appropriate. And again, releasing every action, assuming that the God who works with the world the way the world is will take your actions and weave them redemptively into the divine nature, and through them make a difference in the immediate place where you are working, living, having your being, but also throughout this whole wide universe. Because God can take action here, integrate it into who God is, and then use it to make an effect there. God is not limited to space as we are. Therefore, the prayers which we offer in a tiny corner of existence, in the wisdom and providence of God, can make a difference throughout the whole universe. Prayer, through a process understanding of the world, is one of the primary tools for working in the world, not in a passive kind of a way, so that one then closets oneself off in the nearest closet, you know, but in a responsive, open way, so that we in fact address the world, knowing that our prayers make a difference to it. It's almost taking that old biblical injunction, you know, pray without ceasing, and turning it into the reality of our openness to the way the world is and our offering of our concern for that world to God in every moment of our existence, releasing it always to God, and then trusting God to respond, because God is faithful, and God is relational, and therefore God will respond. And we can leave that response to God, and yet continue in an openness that looks for that which is given to us in the immediacy of our moment, that will be our own response to the responsiveness of God in prayer. In a process world, prayer makes a difference. It's the first resort. It's a responsibility of every person, which is then released for God to do with as God will, but then opens us to the action which follows every prayer. In a process world, you'd better believe it makes a difference.